The fastest-growing religion on Earth has crossed 2 billion followers. And yet, behind that staggering number, something deeper is shifting. Something quieter, more dangerous, and far more consequential than the headlines most people ever see. This is not a story about Islam disappearing. It is not a story about empty mosques or sudden collapse. In many countries, religious identity remains strong. Ritual remains visible. Demographics remain powerful. But beneath the surface, the old machinery of authority is starting to fracture. The figures who once defined belief, enforced boundaries, and shaped the moral order of entire societies are no longer speaking to a world they fully control. And the generation rising beneath them is no longer waiting for permission to think. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Islam historically was in much of the Muslim world. Not merely a private spiritual identity, not just a matter of belief or weekly worship. For centuries, Islam functioned as a complete civilizational framework. It shaped law, family life, inheritance, commerce, education, public morality, and the social meaning of right and wrong. In many societies, religion was not one institution among many. It was the architecture holding everything together. Islamic law, in its broadest sense, was not simply a set of punishments or prohibitions. It was a total moral universe. It guided marriage and divorce, contracts and charity, prayer and fasting, food and dress, public conduct and private duty. To be born into that world was to be born into a ready-made order, one so comprehensive that most people never experience the idea of standing outside it. And that order did not rely on one central, pope-like authority. Its strength came from something more resilient, a distributed web of legitimacy. Scholars, judges, imams, teachers, local clerics, Sufi networks, religious schools, each played a role. Authority was embedded in everyday life. If you had a question about inheritance, if your child needed an education, the madrasa did more than teach literacy. It transmitted an entire moral grammar. This created a dense ecosystem of learning, custom, and discipline that was almost impossible to escape, because it was almost impossible to compare with anything else. Most people did not have access to rival systems, rival interpretations, or rival moral worlds. Books were scarce. Literacy was uneven. Travel was difficult. Information moved slowly. Community defined reality. That system survived astonishing shocks. It endured invasions, empires, colonization, and the rise of modern states. In fact, many modern states didn't destroy religious authority. They absorbed it. Governments from North Africa to South Asia learned that religion could reinforce legitimacy, stabilize identity, and discipline society. Ministries of religious affairs were built. Endowments were nationalized. Friday sermons were monitored. Religious curricula were standardized. In some places, clerical authority became entangled with state power so deeply that challenging one increasingly meant challenging the other. That was the deal. Rulers gained sacred cover, and religious institutions gained political protection. But hidden inside that arrangement was a structural vulnerability. The moment belief becomes too closely tied to power, every spiritual dispute risks becoming a political crisis. That is the crack now widening across the Muslim world. Because when younger generations question clerics, they are often not only questioning theology, they are questioning the institutions, hierarchies, and political systems that claim divine legitimacy. That makes the crisis far bigger than belief. It turns doubt into dissent. It turns interpretation into power struggle. It turns conscience into a threat. And for a long time, the old order still held. It held because information remained scarce, fragmented, and filtered. Then, the filter broke. The internet did not destroy Islam, but it did something almost as disruptive to traditional authority. It shattered the monopoly over interpretation. Suddenly, religious knowledge was no longer mediated only through the local imam, the state-approved scholar, or the inherited school of thought. A young Muslim in Cairo could compare rulings from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, Europe, and North America within minutes. A university student in Jakarta could listen to a conservative preacher, then a reformist scholar, then a female exegete, then a secular critic, all in one evening. A teenager in Casablanca could see how Muslims in London, Kuala Lumpur, and Dearborn live their faith differently, and begin asking the most destabilizing question of all. If all these people claim Islam, who gets to decide what real Islam is? That is where the old certainty starts to shake. Not necessarily because people stop believing, but because they start comparing. And comparison changes everything. It exposes contradictions. It reveals pluralism where institutions once projected unity. It makes inherited authority look less like destiny and more like one option among many. The result is not simple secularization. It is fragmentation. It is renegotiation. It is the transformation of religion from a fixed inheritance into a contested field of choice. And this pressure is intensified by modern culture itself. Today's younger generations are raised inside systems of personalization. Their feeds are personalized. Their music is personalized. Their identities are curated, revised, and displayed. They are trained from childhood to expect selection, not submission. So when that expectation reaches the realm of belief, the consequences are profound. Systems built on obedience face generations formed by customization. Instructions built on inherited conformity face people who instinctively ask, why this interpretation and not another? Why this authority and not mine? Why command instead of consent? This is where the real drama begins. Because the numbers do not show a mass collapse of Islam, far from it. The global Muslim population continues to rise, powered largely by demographics, age structure, and population momentum. Most Muslims still identify as Muslim. In many countries, formal retention remains extremely high. So the easy story, the sensational story, that Islam is simply vanishing is false. But that only makes the real story more explosive. Because the deeper crisis is not about how many leave. It is about what happens when millions remain inside the tradition while quietly redefining their relationship to authority. When trust weakens, when ritual becomes personal instead of institutional, when identity remains but obedience loosens, when the mosque still stands but the monopoly is gone. And once a monopoly on meaning is broken, history suggests it is almost impossible to restore. That is the shift now unsettling governments, clerics, and gatekeepers across the Islamic world. Not open revolt everywhere, not dramatic apostasy at scale, something more subtle, more difficult to measure, and potentially more transformative. A generation that still speaks the language of faith, but increasingly wants to decide for itself what faith means. And if that trend accelerates, then what is coming next will not just challenge old scholars. It could challenge the entire political architecture that was built on the assumption that inherited religious authority would always be obeyed. And this is where the easy narrative falls apart. Because if you only look at the raw population numbers, you miss the real shock entirely. Islam is not shrinking on a global scale. It is expanding with extraordinary force. Pew Research Center's 2025 analysis found that from 2010 to 2020, the number of Muslims worldwide increased by 347 million, reaching 2.0 billion. More growth in absolute terms than any other major religion during that decade. That rise was driven overwhelmingly by demographics, youth, fertility, and population momentum, not by some giant wave of conversion or reconversion. In other words, the surface still looks strong, the numbers still look historic, the structure still looks massive. But what if the crisis is not about how many people carry the label? What if the crisis is about whether the old custodians of that label still command trust? Because beneath that global expansion, survey data has been capturing something slower, darker, and far more destabilizing: the erosion of confidence in religious authority itself. Arab Barometer, one of the most respected public opinion projects in the Middle East and North Africa, documented a major decline in trust in religious leaders and Islamist parties between its earlier and later survey waves in the 2000s, alongside a rise in the share of respondents describing themselves as not religious, especially among younger people. Then, in the early 2020s, some of that trend partially reversed as youth religiosity rebounded in several countries, likely shaped by pandemic anxiety, economic stress, and social breakdown. But that rebound did not restore the old order. It exposed something even more volatile. Religiosity itself was becoming unstable, reactive, personal, and fragmented. It was no longer moving in one predictable direction. It was swinging under pressure. That is the point so many observers miss. The old story was simple: devout or secular, obedient or apostate, inside or outside. But reality in 2026 looks nothing like that. What is emerging across parts of the Muslim world is not a clean collapse into unbelief. It is a splintering into categories institutions were never built to manage. Believers who reject clerical control, culturally Muslim youth who still identify with Islam but resist enforcement, religious conservatives who distrust state-approved scholars, spiritually curious people drifting between labels, and citizens who still speak the language of faith while quietly refusing its institutional discipline. That kind of fragmentation is more dangerous to centralized authority than open rebellion, because it does not always announce itself. It spreads underneath the vocabulary of continuity. And nowhere does that hidden rupture appear more explosive than Iran. For decades, the Islamic Republic projected an image of overwhelming religious uniformity. State narratives claimed near-total Muslim identification. But a major 2020 survey by Gaman, using anonymous online methods and drawing more than 50,000 respondents, found something radically different. Only 40% identified as Muslim, while large shares selected atheist, spiritual, agnostic, or no religion, and many rejected compulsory religious law in public life. Gaman's later analyses and follow-up work continued to point to a profound gap between the state's official religious image and what many Iranians report when they are able to answer anonymously. Researchers and analysts also note methodological caveats. The surveys are online, not perfectly representative, and skew toward the connected and literate. But the scale of divergence remains extraordinary. That gap alone tells a devastating story. When faith is fused to coercion for too long, people may not simply reject a government. They may begin rejecting the authority structure that government tried to sanctify. This is where something just broke in the old formula. Because religion can survive doubt. It can survive argument. It can survive criticism, hypocrisy, even scandal. But it becomes far more vulnerable when obedience stops being automatic. And that is the silent revolution now unfolding across digital Muslim life. The first fully connected generation does not encounter Islam as a sealed inheritance. It encounters Islam in comparison. One sermon beside another, one legal school against another, one national model beside another, one woman arguing for reform, another demanding stricter orthodoxy, a third stepping away entirely. The phone screen becomes the battlefield. The algorithm becomes the new gate. And the old monopoly on meaning begins to dissolve. That does not mean the future belongs to secularism. The data does not support that claim. It means the future belongs to competition. Competition between interpretations, between institutions, between political models, between visions of what Islam is supposed to be in public life. And once that competition becomes normalized, the old guardians face a brutal choice: adapt and accept a world in which faith must increasingly persuade rather than command, or harden, and try to rebuild obedience through censorship, surveillance, and punishment. But history is merciless on this point. Communications revolutions do not restore old monopolies. They force them into struggle. The winners are not always the loudest. They are the ones capable of surviving comparison. That is why this story is bigger than Islam alone. It is about what happens to any authority system when inherited legitimacy meets a generation trained to question, customize, and compare. The old order still has institutions. It still has power. In some places, it still has the law, the pulpit, the classroom, even the police. But for the first time, it no longer has uncontested control over the imagination of the young. And once a generation learns that belief can be negotiated, authority can be resisted, and identity can be redefined, the final outcome is no longer determined from above. It begins to move from hand to hand, screen to screen, conscience to conscience. And that is where the real transformation begins. And now, the system reaches its moment of truth. Because once monopoly authority is broken, there are only two paths left. The first path is adaptation. The second is coercion. And everything now unfolding across the Muslim world, from the pulpit to the parliament, from the classroom to the smartphone screen, suggests that this choice is no longer theoretical. It is already here. The adaptation path is the quieter one, but it may be the more revolutionary. It does not require Islam to disappear. It does not require belief to collapse. It requires something more difficult: that religious institutions accept a world in which faith must increasingly be chosen, argued for, and lived through persuasion rather than enforced through inherited obedience. This is the logic many scholars have described in different forms for years. Religion surviving not as an unquestioned public command system, but as a moral and spiritual tradition operating inside societies where personal conscience, pluralism, and individual agency matter far more than they once did. In that model, Islam does not die. It changes form. It becomes less compulsory, less monopolistic, less fused to the machinery of the state. For traditional gatekeepers, that feels like loss. For a younger generation raised inside permanent comparison, it may feel like the only version of faith that can survive the future. But the second path is the one that makes headlines. The hardening path, the crackdown path, the path where institutions, frightened by fragmentation, try to restore control through fear. More censorship, more blasphemy prosecutions, more monitoring of sermons, classrooms, influencers, and online speech. More pressure on women's bodies as visible symbols of obedience. More efforts to turn theological disagreement into a legal offense. That instinct is understandable from the perspective of power. When rulers and clerics sense the ground moving beneath them, they tighten their grip. But there is a trap hidden inside that reaction. Every escalation designed to force belief ends up revealing the same devastating weakness. If faith needs force to survive, then authority has already lost the argument. That is the lesson, buried in modern Iran's data, and in the wider regional turbulence as well. The more religion is fused with compulsion, the more it risks being judged not as transcendence, but as control. And once that association hardens in the imagination of the young, the backlash can outlive any single regime. In Gamon's 2020 Iran Religion Survey, only 40% of respondents identified as Muslim, while majorities rejected compulsory religious legislation and compulsory hijab. Even accounting for methodological limits, the survey revealed a massive divergence between official religious identity and private self-reporting under anonymity. That divergence matters because it suggests something political systems fear most. Not simply dissent, but concealed detachment on a national scale. And once concealed detachment enters the picture, the old numbers stop telling the whole story. Yes, Islam remains the world's fastest growing major religion. Pew found that Muslims increased by 347 million between 2010 and 2020, reaching 25.6% of the global population. Yes, most people raised Muslim still identify as Muslim. But those macro-demographic facts do not settle the internal struggle over authority, legitimacy, and control. In fact, they may intensify it. Because now the battle is not over whether Islam exists. It is over which Islam will dominate the century ahead. An Islam of state enforcement, inherited hierarchy, and institutional command. Or an Islam increasingly reshaped by choice, personalization, and contested interpretation. This is where history delivers its warning. Communications revolutions do not politely ask old authorities for permission. They expose them to competition. The printing press did not erase Christianity, but it shattered the Catholic Church's uncontested grip over interpretation in Europe. The internet is creating a structurally similar challenge across the Muslim world today. Not identical, not simple, but brutally familiar in its logic. Once millions of people can compare scholars, laws, lifestyles, national systems, and religious vocabularies in real time, authority is no longer inherited automatically. It has to be earned again and again in public. That is a far harsher environment than the old one, and many institutions were never built for it. What makes this moment so explosive is that the generation now inheriting the crisis is the first fully digital Muslim generation. The first to grow up with instant access to rival interpretations at all times. The first whose moral world was never geographically contained. The first to watch a preacher in Riyadh, a reformist in Kuala Lumpur, a scholar in Istanbul, and a skeptic in Berlin in the same hour. The first to experience religion not as one sealed civilizational package, but as an endless comparison engine. Arab Barometer's more recent work shows that religiosity among youth can rebound under stress, especially during periods of economic anxiety and social breakdown. But even that return does not rebuild the old monopoly. It happens in a fragmented landscape where religion is increasingly personal, unstable, and politically contested. That is why the old order is nervous. It can handle opposition. It knows how to denounce critics, arrest dissidents, censor books, and intimidate public unbelief. But how do you control ambiguity? How do you police a generation that still uses the language of faith while refusing inherited obedience? How do you punish personalization? How do you stop millions of quiet reinterpretations happening in private messages, podcasts, YouTube videos, and anonymous accounts? You can shut down a protest. You can raid a newsroom. You can imprison an activist. But you cannot easily reverse a civilization-wide shift in expectations once young people start believing that conscience outranks command. And that may be the deepest secret hidden inside all this data. Civilizations rarely collapse in one dramatic explosion. More often, something inside them stops being automatic. A story loses its monopoly. A ritual loses its certainty. An institution loses the instinctive obedience it once took for granted. Outward continuity remains. The buildings remain. The titles remain. The official statistics remain. But underneath, choice has entered the system. And once choice enters a structure built on inherited control, the ending has already begun. Even if nobody can yet agree on what the next beginning will look like. So no, this is not the end of Islam. The numbers are far too large for that fantasy, and the faith remains deeply rooted across continents, societies, and generations. But Islam as compulsory public order, as a system that automatically commands courts, bodies, education, and political legitimacy, simply because it inherited that role, that version is under historic pressure. Not from invaders, not from outsiders alone, from within, from its own connected children. From a generation that compares before it obeys. And that is the question now hanging over the future. Will Islamic authority reinvent itself before the rupture becomes irreversible? Or will the institutions that fear change push harder, punish more, and accelerate the very crisis they are trying to stop? Because if belief must now be chosen, not assigned, then the final battle is no longer over numbers. It is over legitimacy, and that battle has already begun.